Hey everybody. Before I get going, I wanted to shout out my friend Spaniel. He just put out a demo for his game Deity, a really neat little first-person fantasy action dungeon crawler sort of thing he's been working hard on for a year or two now. Go check it out on Steam if you got a minute. Alright, so every year I think about doing a Halloween special on my channel. 2022, I only finished it in November, and I took it down a couple months later because it sucked. 2023 and 24, I was really struggling to keep at it on this website for various reasons I won't get into. 2024, I'm finally going to do it. I'm locked in this year. I've produced an hour and a half of video since January, and I just found the perfect story. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the tale of the Colorado Cannibal. The story, as it's usually told, begins on the bitter cold morning of April 16th, 1874. A ragged, weather-worn man stumbles out from the wilderness near the Los Pinos Indian Agency, the institution from which the government controlled the area's Indian reservation. This is, for context, about 20 miles north of what would become Lake City in Colorado. At the time, it was an untamed wilderness caught in the crossfire of the ongoing genocide of the Indians and the discovery of gold in them there hills. Aside from the snow, it's hard to picture a place more evocative of the Wild West. We even have ourselves a bandit. Alferd Packer, that's not a typo, he spelled his name Alferd, has just found his way back to civilization after 2 months alone in the San Jose Mountains. Someone offered him food. He wasn't hungry. Weird, but then again, stress can mess with your stomach. He got comfortable in the mess hall anyway, calming his frayed nerves with a couple shots of whiskey and regaling the men of the Indian Agency with the first version of his story. He said his party had split off from a larger party over in Utah. They got lost in a blizzard and left him behind because his bum leg was slowing them down. He managed to stay alive on a diet of rosebuds, pine gum, and squirrels while looking for safe passage down the mountains. At the time, it seemed believable. Before long, Alferd had shacked up at a bar in Saguache, retelling increasingly wild versions of his story to anyone who'd listen. And then somebody from the original Utah party swung by and recognized him. Recognized him specifically as a man who'd been dead broke the last time they'd met. So how was he affording all that booze? Not long after that, the men he'd claimed had abandoned him in the mountains were found dead and butchered. At this point, Al Packer's story starts to change. One member of the party went nuts and killed 4 of them, so Al killed him and then ate all 5 to survive. Or maybe they all died of natural causes and he ate them. Usually he killed one of them in self-defense, but not always, and little details were changing or getting embellished all the time. The only thing he always copped to was cannibalism. Keep in mind, times were different back then. People knew the frontier was tough. Cannibalism was seen as a disgusting, horrible act, but it could be forgiven in some circumstances. It also wasn't technically illegal. Murder was, and Al couldn't shake that allegation, so he was arrested. And then he escaped immediately and lived in Wyoming for 9 years. Justice caught up to him eventually, as it usually does, and he was finally put on trial for his crimes. While on trial, he said the breast of man was the sweetest meat he'd ever tasted. The judge, one of the only Democratic public officials in the county, told him, quote, "There was 7 Democrats in Hinsdale County, but you ate 5 of them. I sentence you to be hanged by the neck until you're dead, as a warning against reducing the Democratic population of Hinsdale County. Packer, you're a Republican criminal. I would sentence you to hell, but the statutes forbid it." There are no actual historical records that suggest either of them said any of that. It's just a fun urban legend and one of the weirder examples of people politicizing random violent crimes, even though in reality your average violent criminal is too desperate or mentally ill to even conceive of coherent political beliefs. Like how Alan Moore characterized Jack the Ripper as a member of an occult conspiracy with ties to the royal family, even though he was just some Polish dude who killed a couple hookers and spent a couple centuries playing hooky. It makes for a good story, but how much of it is true? In fact, how much of any of this is true? I mean, Alferd was a drunk who was notorious for embellishing the facts. Even if he did only kill the one guy in self-defense, who would have believed him? Who's going to bat for a guy who can't even spell his own damn name? The truth of the case has gotten muddy over the years as the folklore has evolved and generations of researchers have revisited the Colorado Cannibal with new technology or previously unknown information. After spending a while with all the facts I could find on the web, here's the story as I see it. But as usual, I'm not a historian, I'm a nerd with a cheap laptop. Sources are in the description, do your own reading, you know the drill. Also, I actually spent money on this one because a couple of the things I wanted to read were paywalled. I don't make any money on YouTube. If you like what you see here, I'd really appreciate if you shared this video around. You know, send it to 5 of your friends, or else the Colorado Cannibal is gonna get you. You know, assuming he ever actually got anyone to begin with. On that note, our story begins in Utah in November of 1873. A group of 20 prospectors were preparing to leave for the hills of the Colorado Territory. Into this group walked Alferd Packer, who claimed he was an expert guide familiar with the area. He couldn't afford to pay for his provisions, but the prospectors weren't in a position to turn down any help. So they let him in on a payment of $25 and went on their merry way. The prospectors were sick of him before they'd even reached the mountains. He was a bumbling, rambling asshole who wouldn't stop asking the guys how much money they had on hand. He demonstrably couldn't guide worth a damn, mostly because he was an overly confident idiot, but also because his previously unmentioned epilepsy made him sensitive to the reflective sunlight in the snow. He led them off course on a regular basis. There were also rumors beginning to spread that he might have killed a previous partner while working as a trapper. About halfway through December, despite his dubious tracking abilities, Packer and the gang made it to Ute Chief Uray's camp on the Uncoparge River. Uray was known as the white man's friend. He negotiated many treaties on behalf of the Ute tribe that tended to favor the government, believing that appeasing and assimilating would do less damage to his people in the long term than going to war. Look how that turned out. His camp was well established and welcoming, and unlike Packer, he actually knew the area. He'd even created several fledgling trails leading into gold territory. Uray sensibly advised his new companions to spend the winter with him and avoid the mountains until spring. Some of them listened. Oliver D. Luzenizer was raring to go. He and a couple of accomplices made plans to leave for the Los Pinos Indian Agency through the mountains as soon as possible. Al wanted in. Oliver said he'd shoot him if he tried to tag along. A second group followed shortly after, consisting of Israel Swan, Frank Miller, Shannon Bell, George Noon, James Humphrey, and Al Packer. To be fair, most of the competent men were either with Uray or Luzenizer at this point. Pickings were probably slim. I still gotta question why Packer was allowed to lead the party. He had more than demonstrated his incompetence by now. It's likely they weren't as aware as Luzenizer of his transgressions, or as experienced with the ways of the mountains. They probably didn't know what to look out for, in a lot of cases. I mean, the youngest of them was a teenager. Unfortunately, as was too often the case on the frontier, their naivety and inexperience would kill them. Following in his footsteps, these 5 men went stumbling without snowshoes or beasts of burden through dense December snow, every laborious step bringing them closer to an obscure corner of the mountains that local legend would soon christen Dead Man's Gulch. Their provisions lasted a matter of days. Past that, for the duration of the 2 months they spent in the mountains, they made do with whatever they could forage. Packer said, "Our trail was entirely drifted over. In places, the snow had blown away from patches of wild rose bushes, and we were gathering the buds from these bushes, stewing and eating them." Squirrels were occasionally on the table as well, whenever Lady Luck decided to smile their way. He also reported that in a moment of extreme desperation, the party cooked and ate their moccasins. They carried on as long as they could, but the weather and their health was only worsening. So they all hunkered down at the base of a hill in an area with enough tree cover to leave the snow at least a little thinner. Something happened in that alcove that left everybody but Packer dead. What exactly went down is still up in the air. We'll come back to that. All I'll say at this point is he more than likely shot Shannon Bell, and it might have been in self-defense. He sustained himself on the bodies of his companions until mid-April, when the weather was finally permissive enough that this weary, snowblind bastard could safely evade the icy grasp of the Reaper and stumble immediately into another kind of damnation. He showed up at the Indian Agency looking raggedy but well-fed. On his person he had a rifle, a knife, and a coffee pot with some hot coals in it. He wasn't hungry, but boy was he ever thirsty. The man's first move was to request a glass of whiskey. With liquid courage coursing through his veins, he was able to face the past, recounting to the curious and perhaps suspicious men of the agency that he'd been left behind by his party due to his snowblindness and frostbitten feet. He told them he hadn't seen a single human being in weeks. He also claimed food was scarce, and yet he still had a considerable amount of meat on his bones. But nothing stank too badly of foul play just yet. Nobody paid him much mind as he found a home at a bar in Saguache. Over at the bar, in his whiny, squawking voice, Packer told ever more elaborate and astounding tales of his survival to his fellow barmates. He whiled his days away with a rigorous itinerary of drinking, gambling, and rambling. With his poker winnings, he even bought himself a nice horse. And then Preston Nutter of the original Utah party happened to swing by. The company was appreciated until he started asking questions. How was broke-ass Packer able to gamble and drink all day? Wasn't that Frank Miller's knife? Not to mention, the details of Packer's story didn't quite line up with any of his own memories. So Packer changed his story, the first of many significant alterations to come. Suddenly, he knew what had happened to at least one of his party members. Israel Swan, the oldest of the group at 60, had collapsed 10 days in and the whole group ate him together. And then the group abandoned Packer. That lie might suffice for now, but he was sick of all these questions. The snow was thawing, people would be traveling through those mountains again before long. Somebody would inevitably stumble into what he'd left behind. It was time for Packer to pack it up. Just before he could kick bricks without incident, Los Pinos Indian agent Charles Adams, who called himself General Charles Adams, decided to enlist Packer's help in finding his friends. Packer took full advantage, as you might imagine, of this opportunity to obfuscate the truth. Which is to say, they didn't find shit. Whenever they were anywhere near something that looked familiar to Packer, he'd tell Adams he was lost and he didn't know where he was. He'd never seen this place before. It was a pretty uneventful trip all around. While they were out, though, General Adams made a passing remark about Alferd's inexplicable wealth. He didn't take that too well, which made Adams suspicious of him. He took him back to the agency and interrogated the poor bastard so hard he had a seizure. That shook him up enough to get a little more of the truth out. Swan and Humphreys froze and starved respectively, and the group ate him. Miller died under mysterious circumstances while Packer wasn't around. The characteristically generous Packer, perhaps with that Bible verse about camels and needles on his mind, ensured Miller's place in heaven by separating him from his wealth, all $133 of it. And shortly after Miller's passing, conveniently also while Al was out, Shannon Bell had gone trigger-happy, blasting George Noon away with poor old Israel's rifle. Packer defended himself with his own pistol, smashed Shannon's head in with a hatchet to finish him off, and you know the rest from here. Adams believed this to be mostly true on the basis that Al looked, quote, quite fat when he arrived here and has since shown traces of mental aberration, which is said to be the consequences of eating human flesh. He was arrested without trial in early May and held in a makeshift cell on somebody's ranch. No word on where his horse ended up. In August, another outsider found himself in Saguache. Harper Magazine's John Randolph. He was touring the country scouting out unspoiled wilderness to sketch for the magazine. The San Juans, one of the only gold rush destinations still free from corporate-led industrial mining, certainly fit the bill. But what Randolph found at the base of a hill a ways from the Gunnison River was about the furthest thing from unspoiled, inhuman beauty one could imagine. What he discovered in the mountains were the remnants of an ugly and very human act of violence. A man of his craft, he diligently illustrated what he saw regardless. The bones were segregated enough that one could tell where one body ended and another began, which isn't to say they were preserved with any dignity. Israel Swan had his pelvis where his head should have been. James Humphrey's ribs were cradling his skull. Shannon Bell's legs were splayed out too wide. His left knee was up by his elbow. He and George Noon still had flesh and hair on their faces and chest. Their lips and empty eye sockets stuck for months now in expressions of shock and pain. Frank Miller was headless. Clothes had been pulled and torn from the bodies haphazardly like skin off the carcasses of animals. Not visible in the illustration are the countless incisions present on these bones, or the holes in the backs of each skull. James had never heard of Al Packer before, but he knew what he was looking at. This was a mass murder, 5 men killed in rapid succession. The men were given the closest thing possible to a Christian burial, laid to rest together in a mass grave on site. Now looking at a murder charge, Packer escaped his cell. He ran off to Wyoming, maybe on that horse he bought with Frank Miller's money, and told everyone his name was John Schwartz. He was Schwartz for 9 years before being found out. Exactly one source on the entire internet will tell you his ruse was uncovered by an itinerant merchant named Frenchy Carbizoni. I can't confirm that detail. This article is the only thing that pops up when you Google that name, but I really hope a man named Frenchy Carbizoni once walked this earth. But, regardless of who it was, somebody turned Packer in. That's the important part here. This time, he was given a trial in Hinesdale County, and he introduced a brand new version of his story while he was on the hot seat. Shannon killed everyone while they were sleeping, except for Packer, who was out foraging. He caught Bell in the act and was attacked with a hatchet, so he shot the assailant twice and, ate him. He claimed he tried every day to leave their little grotto, but the weather made that impossible. Which was probably true up to a point, and his lawyer had some strong words to say, but I don't think anyone was surprised when he got 40 years. The judge, Melville B. Jerry, was among the county's only Democrats. Some lowbrow retellings, including my own up front, turned him into a cartoonish caricature of what was, at the time, the party most associated with Backwater Hicks. A man out for revenge against the party of Lincoln and all that. Now, I would love it if he actually said all that stuff about, I will sentence you to hell, and you ate 5 Democrats. I've repeated that quote around a couple of campfires since I first heard this story. It's how I always introduce Alferd Packer to people. It's equal parts unsurprising and disappointing that what he actually said was, Alferd Packer, the judgment of this court is that you be removed from hence to the jail of Hinesdale County, and there be confined until the 19th day of May, A.D. 1883, and that on said 19th day of May, 1883, you be taken from thence by the sheriff of Hinesdale County to a place of execution prepared for this purpose, at some point within the corporate limits of the town of Lake City, in the said country of Hinesdale, and between the hours of 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. of said day, you, then and there, by said sheriff, be hung by the neck until you are dead, 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 and may God have mercy upon your soul. Which is still colorful. The dead, dead, dead part is true, at least, but I miss all that stuff about Democrats. And despite the dramatically imposed death sentence, he'd be spared on a technicality by the state Supreme Court. See, he'd committed his murders in 1874 in the Colorado Territory, and by 1883 the Territory's laws had been replaced by a different set of state laws. They appealed on that basis, and the Supreme Court gave them a retrial in Gunnison. They were hoping that by placing the retrial elsewhere, further from the crime scene, they would have a less biased, more distant courtroom, which didn't happen at all. Frontier people all over Colorado had deep-seated reasons to hate this guy, regardless of where they were from. The judge in Gunnison sentenced him to 40 years in the joint for manslaughter. In prison, he made rope and bridles and kept to himself. He was a quiet guy. At first. Before I wrap up Packer's story, I want to get into exactly why nobody on the frontier had any sympathy for the guy. Other cases of survival cannibalism have been seen as sympathetic, if not forgivable. Why not Packer? The answer, detailed in Diana DiStefano's Alferd Packer's World, is simple. The mountain men had a code, and Packer's entire life was a testament to what happened when you didn't follow it. As a prospector, one had to be skilled and knowledgeable, capable of taking care of himself and his companions. Out here, the discovery of gold and the ceding of territory from the Utes was recent enough that industrial mining hadn't moved in yet. Prospecting was done manually here, in a place where winter lasted up to 9 months. Blizzards and avalanches were facts of life. Avalanches could be predicted in theory. There were places especially prone to them, but believing any place was truly safe was foolish at best. Countless men came here looking for gold and left grateful for their mere lives. Even an experienced prospector could die in the San Juans, which didn't mitigate the fact that many deaths were completely avoidable. And guys who knew what they were doing didn't usually feel too bad talking shit about the ones who could have lived if they hadn't been so confidently ignorant. There's a lot you could do to prevent your untimely demise, or at least make it less likely. Most teams of prospectors brought a donkey or mule with them. Some folks like to take their animal by the tail and let it lead the way through uncertain terrain. One guy also claimed 3 donkeys dug him out of the snow when he fell in, which, once again, I really want to be true. Other people opted to use these funky new shoes the Norwegians brought over. Skis were great because they were easier to improvise than the indigenous variety of snowshoes. If you could find a tree, you could make a ski. The article I read retells a story where 3 miners left their tunnel following an avalanche to discover that their cabin was gone, and all their provisions with it. Thankfully, they'd kept their skis at the mine entrance. The only way out was a steep slope edged with vast gorges. Skiing down this slope, they had to make a jump 50 feet down. One of them fell headfirst into the snow. One guy lost his skis and somersaulted into the drifts. The third guy landed perfectly, of course. He helped both of them out, and even though they could only find one of the second guy's skis, they all managed to make it to civilization by sunset. This story is a perfect example of how important skis were, but there's another equally important takeaway: cooperation. Nobody survived the mountains on his own. Everyone who knew what he was doing knew that. Though prospectors were ostensibly freelancers, they all mutually agreed to help each other out as much as they could. I feel like America has kind of lost that spirit over the years. A lot has been said about the death of specialization. We all know the modern workforce is mostly passionless generalists. What about the death of mutual support networks, though? We don't talk about that enough. These guys were on that grind set. They were rugged individuals who wanted to make themselves rich. Yet they went out of their way to help one another. They made sure their cabins were well stocked for folks lost in storms, and once they'd really established themselves, they got into the habit of mounting missions to rescue people caught in avalanches. They weren't always kind people. Like I said, they openly shamed those who didn't know what they were doing, regardless of their current level of mortality. They constantly told and retold stories of people dying, but I hope it's clear by now that they weren't assholes. They were trying to keep people safe. And Al Packer appeared out of the drifts like a manifestation of what they were trying to keep everyone safe from. Even a decade after the fact, the people of the San Juans were still overwhelmingly in favor of letting Packer hang. They were pissed when he got off with a mere 4 decades. Imagine how they felt when newspapers and vast swaths of the public started arguing in favor of paroling him early, less than halfway through that sentence. 17 years is a long time, but that's still a weird development. Basically a complete 180 from the public opinion that got him locked up. What happened? Well, the city of Denver happened. Because of economic developments initially spurned on by the gold rush, Colorado's population was booming. What started as an influx of miners and mining companies developed into a new generation of less adventurous folks who wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes in the San Juans. Unwelcome opportunists with no respect for the land or its traditions, these people were to the prospectors as the prospectors had been to the Indians. They hardly talked to the actual prospectors directly. What knowledge they had of the frontier lifestyle was primarily founded on second or third-hand sources. So, they knew enough to be aware that survival cannibalism had happened before, but not enough to understand how and why most prospectors were able to avoid that fate. It was within this new cultural climate that Al Packer met Polly Pry of the Denver Post. And yeah, she was a journalist named Pry. I swear she's real and not a Kojima character. It's a really on-the-nose name, though, isn't it? She was kind of an over-the-top character, though, a sob sister whose dramatic prose style and exposés on serious topics made her the Post's lead star from about the moment she got the job. She wrote an article on the mental health system called Our Insane Treatment of the Insane, and she would later be fired for reporting that was interpreted as anti-union. Years later, while running her own paper, she was fired upon for her reporting, which got her out of the news and gossip business for good. Pry has a hell of a personality in her own right, basically, and I might come back to her later. For now, though, in the context of this video, Pry is just Al Packer's most sympathetic correspondent. She was working on a no-doubt sensational account of the prison system when she became the first reporter to ever talk Al into an interview. Probably because she was the first person in a long time who took everything he said at face value. And yeah, Packer was an idiot. But he wasn't stupid. Pry was the state's preeminent investigative journalist, and she'd fallen for his stories as hard as Shannon Bell had fallen into the snow after he died of natural causes shortly following being shot and clubbed in the head, or whatever the story was by now. Okay, to be clear, Al wasn't really changing his story anymore. Shannon went nuts and killed the 2 survivors while Al was out foraging, and he was in turn killed in self-defense. That's the story that made it to the papers. They printed his words in Pry's, and boy did she ever have some hot takes. Without consulting any prospector besides Al, she invoked the legal precedent for ships lost at sea. She argued that since sailors were allowed to eat one another in hopeless situations, prospectors should be extended the same leniency. Coupled with her expert pathos-driven reporting and Packer's dubious first-hand accounts, these arguments were pretty convincing to the burgeoning population of Denver. And the subject matter was exactly the kind of scandalous working-class violence those sorts of people eat up like candy. Polly and Packer were making the Denver Post a lot of money. And so Pry, convinced of Al's innocence, but also well aware that even the juiciest scoop of her career could go stagnant overnight, talked her bosses into paying for his legal fees. In 1897, C.L. Stonecker of the Pardons Board received a letter from Packer himself requesting a pardon. It opened on a description of conditions among Lutzenizer's party, claiming they'd drawn straws to decide which of them would be eaten first. Basically as a way of saying, hey, They weren't so different from me. Why am I being treated different? Stonecker took that into consideration. Unfortunately for Packer, he also considered other people's opinions. He observed that most of the people backing Packer were new arrivals living in urban areas, and that most of the old-timers and mountain folks still had beef. He tracked down Preston Nutter from the Utah Party, if you remember him. Preston said, quote, "If any sane man could have seen the mutilated bodies of those men, knowing the existing conditions as I know them, and heard the different stories Packers told about the affair, and then want to turn that kind of man loose on a community, I would say open all doors and turn all criminals out." Which, I'll be real, that one's dramatic enough to scratch the Democrats' itch for me. Even so, portions of the public still increasingly sided with the Colorado Cannibal. Prize writing highlighted how bad prison had been for his mental health, and, incredibly, he suggested he could bring further fame and riches to the young, up-and-coming state of Colorado by touring America as a Wild West act called Packer the Maneater. Wild West shows were getting popular at the time, as the frontier was paved over, and nostalgia for those times was turning into an industry, especially among people who'd never actually lived through those times. There was pushback, of course, and the Democrat judge himself even reached out to Polly, telling her to interview anyone from the jury, or literally anyone besides Packer who was around at the time. But the old-timers and prospectors were outnumbered by now. Packer was ultimately paroled in 1901 after Governor Charles S. Thomas, a Democrat, bent to public pressure. Packer never went on tour as a Wild West act, not for lack of interest. The guys who owned the paper Polly worked for offered him a boatload of cash to work at the sideshow in the circus they also owned. But at that point, he'd already spent years of his life in the media circus. He had little interest in joining the media's circus. Instead, he spent his final years in quiet solitude. He raised rabbits and chickens, maintained a flower garden, and may have also built dollhouses. The Colorado Cannibal went out with a whimper. He passed 6 years after he was released to little fanfare, but now that he was dead, his legend wasn't restricted to the body of an old man who was far less interesting than the press wanted him to be. Popular culture was already appropriating his story while the body was still warm, and it hasn't let up. If you're familiar with his story already, it's probably through South Park creator Trey Parker's Cannibal the Musical. That wasn't even the first musical about this guy, and even outside of musicals, there's been songs about him. Phil Oak's Ballad of Alferd Packer is a well-known one. Its lyrics first appeared in Broadside magazine issue number 48, and a recording was included on his compilation Broadside Tapes Volume 1. As far as 60s folk songs go, it ain't much to write home about. The final line of the chorus is a limp punchline with too many syllables, and the verses are firmly okay. The subject matter is its most novel feature. And hey, don't let that read as a knock against Phil Oakes. The dude actually did a lot of great work. He is best known today for Love Me, I'm a Liberal, which has been covered so often it's hard to believe any single mortal man can lay claim to its creation. And aside from that, I also strongly recommend Too Many Martyrs. What the fuck, he also wrote Draft Dodger Rag? I always assumed that one was Pete Seeger. Anyhow, yeah, Coloradans have attached Al Packer's name to just about anything. There's an annual Alferd Packer barbecue in Gunnison, and an Alferd Packer grill at UC Boulder. It used to serve an El Cannibal burrito, which doesn't appear to be on the modern menu. I also swear I read a story somewhere about an Al Packer group in Congress who wanted to flip 5 Democrat seats and identified with Al Packer because he also, got rid of 5 Democrats. I can't for the life of me figure out where I read that, and I haven't been able to find it since. I think it's in this one article on JSTOR that I forgot to download because it was mostly repeat information. So take that with a grain of salt. Part of me thinks I made it up entirely, but I hope it's obvious why I felt it was worth including. His legacy is carried on into the later 20th century too, in the form of a reevaluation of the crime scene. This is conducted by Professor James E. Starrs, who applied modern forensic techniques to a litany of historic crimes, including the Boston Strangler and the Borden Hatchet murders. Al Packer is the first case mentioned in his obituary, and reading him talking about it, it's obvious the Colorado Cannibal held a special place in his heart. Going through the Washington Post article published just before his investigation started, you get the impression he was charmed by Packer and wanted him to be innocent. He said, "At first he doesn't seem a particularly sympathetic figure, but the more I get into it, the more sympathetic he becomes. He could have gotten into a Wild West show as the world's biggest cannibal and made millions of dollars as a result, but he turned it down. He was very grassroots. I guess Robert Bolt would have called him the common man. I think at bottom my view would have been that he probably shot Bell, but I don't think he killed the others. Either Bell went berserk or Alfred Packer went berserk. It could be that Packer returned and found Bell in the process of cooking the remains and decided to shoot him. Either through disenchantment or otherwise, I think he killed Bell in a sufficiently homicidal fashion to be guilty of something. After the investigation was complete, he called Packer guilty as sin. The Post also spoke to Starr's wife of 35 years with whom he had fathered 8 children. Asked why he was so hung up on Packer, she said, "I'm really sorry, but I couldn't even begin to suggest why. I'm sure he has professional motives for doing it. I'm sure they're very valid." James responded to that comment by letting the Post know she thinks a lot of his ideas are a waste of time, including his bicycle book. Yeah, among Starr's other projects is a book called The Noiseless Tenor, The Bicycle in Literature. It's a collection of short stories and excerpts from longer works, all related in some fashion to bicycles and bicycling. I get the impression Starr's was a little like Don Quixote if some of the windmills were actually giants. Does that make sense? Well, Packer was one of his giants. He set out to find the truth of the Packer case, and he got us closer than we'd ever been. Looking at what he dug up, it's easy to say he just confirmed the pre-existing consensus opinion, but he did it so much more thoroughly than anyone had ever managed before. The new details he uncovered are worth knowing and add a lot of depth to our understanding of how that day went down. Most of the wounds attributed to butchering were concentrated on the bodies' backs, implying Al didn't want to look his food in the eyes. Wounds on 3 of the bodies, including George Noon's, suggest they put up a fight. Starrs took this in particular as a piece of evidence against Packer, since an injury from the war would have made it hard for Shannon to overpower a younger man. Unless he used a gun, as Packer once claimed. Put a pin in that. For now, the gun story seems flimsy. All 4 skulls present at the mass grave had visible evidence of blunt force trauma and sharp force trauma, and 3 bodies carried similar wounds on their arms. This is, quote, most likely the result of blows from an implement such as the blunt end of a small axe or hatchet. The sharp force trauma is, quote, consistent with hacking actions with a wide blade such as from the sharp end of an axe or hatchet. Holes in the pelvises of 4 men, which had previously been described as potential gunshot wounds, were reconsidered as damage from scavenging bears. That's not why I asked you to put a pin in the gun thing, by the way. Keep that pin in place. We're not done entertaining the idea that 4 out of 5 of these men were shot in the same general region of their pelvis. Now, the actual reason we're talking about gunshot wounds is because of a later investigation by David Bailey, curator of the Museum of Western Colorado. One of the museum's most notable attributes is the Audrey Thrailkill collection, a massive assortment of historical firearms, often collected with little to no context. One pistol was labeled simply, "This gun was found at the site where Alfred Packer killed and ate 5 of his traveling companions." The gun in question is an 1862 Colt police revolver coated in thick rust. Its wooden grip has long since rotted away. The spring is in pieces. 3 of its 5 rounds have been sitting in their chambers longer than my family has been in America. The other 2 might have killed Shannon Bell. I started this channel because as a kid I loved this TV show called Mysteries at the Museum, where every segment opened with a dramatic introduction to an artifact that was used by somebody in the story they were telling. That was me kind of trying to ape that style a little. I hope it worked for you. I'm happy with how that turned out. But yeah, the pistol was specifically Colt's 1873 38 cal re-release, which was cheap and popular at the time among prospectors. It had made its way from the San Juans to Bailey through a series of firearm collectors. The story instantly consumed Bailey's thoughts. He had to know as much as he could. He scrounged up as much information on the case as he could and came away believing, like an intellectual second coming of Polly Pry, that Packer was innocent. Some reporting from the time paints him and Starrs almost like rivals. Starrs is quoted as saying, "It wasn't a bullet hole at all, it was a carnivore gnaw mark. It had none of the classic marks of a bullet hole. Packer was quite a con artist, and apparently he's still at it." But Bailey might have had the last laugh on the bullet thing, at least. He said, "It was a weird place for a hole to be. It's possible the bullet hole went through and animals gnawed on it afterwards." He went on to say, "Starrs proved they were traumatized and murdered, but he didn't prove who did it." Neither would Bailey, as it happens, but in 2001 he did manage to uncover a miraculous smoking gun. He examined the samples Starrs' team had kept above ground in 1989 under an electron microscope, hoping to find something, anything, left over from a century-old bullet. And there it was. 50 microns of lead, consistent with the kind used in the Civil War era. Of course, this proves less than Bailey might have admitted to. 4 of the recovered pelvises have similar wounds, and only 2 bullets ever left the pistol. Even taking the rifle into account, what happened here? There were 4 pelvises with bullet/carnivore wounds, so maybe Shannon Bell shot 3 of the men in the pelvis to cripple them while they were sleeping, then came at them from the front with a hatchet before flipping them around and using the hatchet to bash their heads in. And then Packer came back and shot Bell in the same part of the pelvis in a quick act of self-defense? Or maybe Packer lined all the men up and shot 1 bullet through all of their pelvises and it stopped just shy of hitting the 5th guy. The holes are, in fact, weird, and we do have proof that at least one of them was probably a gunshot wound. It's not as unlikely as I'm making it sound that these holes are more meaningful than I've interpreted them as. I'm just having a little fun. Bailey succeeded admirably, actually, in proving that the facts of the case might have been closer to Packer's version of events than previously expected. And the shot winding up in the pelvis, i.e. not the first place you'd choose to shoot someone, implies it was probably done hastily in self-defense. But Bell's skeleton also has defensive wounds from the hatchet. It's entirely possible Bell put up more of a fight than anyone else. He didn't go down from the hatchet, maybe he picked up the rifle, so Packer shot him in self-defense. That could also explain why Packer chose to single him out as the crazy one when he told his story. At the end of the day, we're hardly any closer than the men of the Indian Agency to knowing what really happened in the San Juans all those years ago. You could write a convincing argument against Packer or Bell. Me personally, I think Packer did it. I wish that weren't the case. It's a more interesting story if he's innocent, and frankly, I've known a ton of dudes who remind me of him. Guys who exaggerate whenever they tell stories to the point you're always a little worried about what'll happen if they ever end up in any real trouble. I came into this on Bailey's side and left unable to convince myself of his perspective. To me, at least, the evidence points the other way. Of course, please keep in mind, once again, I'm just some nerd with a laptop. Go check out what Stars and Bailey had to say for yourselves. The links are in the description. Bailey's in particular is available through a magazine article reposted on older versions of the museum's website. It's a charmingly personal first-person narrative that probably wouldn't make its way onto a museum's official site these days. I miss that kind of stuff. One more thing before we go, and it doesn't have anything to do with Packer. The paper I read about prospecting culture included a poem written by a man of the mountains about a couple of neighbors who met their ends in an avalanche, so comprehensively obliterated that this poem is now the only proof they ever existed. The words their neighbor wrote about them are their complete biographies. Thankfully, it's a poem by a prospector. It's straightforward and light on flowery language, meaning you can, in fact, still figure out roughly who these guys were. The only ambiguity, in my opinion, is what the exact nature of their relationship was. I'll let you be the judge of that. Will Clark was but a lad, not yet 18. We knew some household darling he had been. For he had gentle speech and dainty ways, appeared to yearn for our goodwill and praise. The other, Jack Monroe, was the reverse. He sandwiched every sentence with a curse. Defiant seemed, alike of God and man, to such extremes his daily action ran. Yet strange to say, his friendship for the youth was strong as death and beautiful as truth. We found his giant body wedged between the splintered rafters and effectual screen. From their sharp spears, shielding the tender frame, as oft his tongue had sheltered him from blame. One great hand held the slender finger close, one crouched the head in its last long repose. And thus they sleep, our pitying hands provided, who living loved and death were not divided.